the full story that's just coming to be exposed now, like on Tucker Carlson and all these other sites, and even the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, that are exposing the things that we were talking about over a year ago. That was really, really clear. The evidence was very strong that there was gain-of-function research funded by the NIH to the tune of millions of dollars.
Your book is phenomenal. It's required reading for this time in our lives.
It's a useful resource.
The truth about COVID-19. And first I want to ask you about underlying susceptibility to COVID-19, because in the book you mentioned that COVID-19 really appears to be a trigger for underlying pre-existing chronic diseases. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's as most people are aware of now, you're really only targeting very specific age groups, typically the elderly or the metabolically inflexible, people who are relatively insulin resistant. So when you have that the combination, it makes you predisposed to getting COVID-19. And another big variable is vitamin D sufficiency. So it's not a big issue as much now because we're entering summer, but generally 80% of the U.S. population has less than optimal levels of vitamin D. And because even if you were in the summer and you live in a place where the sun's available, most people are working. Yeah. So they're not outside, they're working inside, and they're not exposing their skin to sun. I mean, if they do, you almost have to go outside in a bathing suit to get enough sun exposure to raise your vitamin D levels to healthy levels. And actually, I used to write papers pretty regularly, but I hadn't written any this century until last year. I had a paper published on vitamin D reviewing the benefits of vitamin D and susceptibility to COVID. And the evidence is pretty compelling.
Yeah.
So it's a big, big issue. And
there's a ton of studies on it now. Ton.
Well, there are even more. I haven't looked recently, but when I finished the paper, there weren't any published randomized controlled trials, which is, or an RCT, which is the definitive proof, quote unquote, because otherwise it's just correlation, and correlation doesn't prove causation. But there's a lot of strong suggestions that it's really useful. Precisely.
Yeah. We've talked a little bit about that. Of course, the susceptibility, underlying susceptibility, and also using it in treatment, high dose vitamin D. There was one study recently that was done. We'll put that up for everybody to see on the YouTube version. But I didn't even know you were working on that to put a paper out on it. That's great.
Yeah, it got published last October in a fairly good peer-reviewed journal called Nutrients.
Sweet. So this is obviously a big underlying issue, but also issues like obesity, heart disease, diabetes. These things have been really exacerbated at a whole different level.
Yeah, those are symptoms of an underlying issue, which is like insulin resistance. And I believe another variable that very few people talk about, even those who are relatively well studied in natural medicine, would be this excess of a very specific type of fat, or fatty acid specifically called omega-6 fatty acid called linoleic acid. And that's really common in vegetable oils. It's the most common fat in vegetable oils. And it's a little bit of a propaganda there too, because people think vegetables and think vegetables are healthy. So vegetable oils have got to be even healthier, right? And this is the baloney that was thrown at the American public starting in the 50s with Ancel Keys. And when we had this massive transition to introducing all these vegetable oils into the diet. And actually it started in 1866, which all preceded Keys, but when we actually gained the industrial capacity to extract these seed oils, and they're called vegetable oils, but they're more accurately called seed oils, like seeds and nuts. And they're so cheap compared to healthy sources of fat that they're put into everything. So if you're having processed food, dimes of dollars are going to have lots of vegetable oils in there. And that's probably the single most pernicious metabolic toxin that you could put into your body, food-wise. Probably the overall one would be a COVID vaccine.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that.
COVID shot. But these vegetable oils, they are what cause the symptoms that you suggested were putting you at risk. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, degenerative brain disease, Alzheimer's. So these are the probably the single most important variable is your consumption of how much vegetable oils you're taking. So that's why you should not have any. It's an essential fat. Essential means your body can't make it. But if you eat food, if you eat any food, you get enough vegetable. You get enough omega-6, linoleic acid. So anything else is excess, and it's only going to make you worse and unhealthy. Because essentially, it increases oxidative stress in your body, and it really disrupts your mitochondrial function, your body's, their mitochondria's ability to seamlessly generate energy in the form of cellular energy in the form of ATP.
Mm-hmm. So basically, with COVID-19, for example, we see this as this kind of inflammatory response the body has, and it has a tropism towards lung tissue, apparently, and it's a kind of a pro-inflammatory thing. And then we've got the pre-inflamed state of the body, and you're saying that vegetable oil consumption in our culture is a big reason behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it radically increases the risk for these inflammatory markers and these cytokines, which are these inflammatory mediators, these little tiny proteins that cause these cascades of a whole wide variety of these modulators of inflammation. Because inflammation isn't necessarily bad. You have to have some, and that's the way your body fights infections. It fights it acutely with acute inflammatory processes. But the issue is when it gets chronic, and then you throw acute on top of that, and you've got a nightmare, and you get this spiraling cascade of biological challenges that your body just can't tolerate, and it just succumbs to it. So.
Yeah, this is the thing. Of course, you've been in this field, leading the way for so long and for so many of us. Yeah. And so you could see a lot of this stuff coming and the underlying susceptibility. And in the book you talk about, and the numbers have even changed since then, but at the time, 94% of folks who lost their lives in association with SARS-CoV-2 had an average of 2.6 pre-existing chronic diseases. I just checked the numbers today. 95% of folks who passed away with COVID-19 on their death certificate had an average of 4 additional causes of death and or pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, and it's just a mess. I mean, this whole thing has been a fabricated nightmare because even getting to the diagnosis of the disease, right? What is really more technically is the SARS-CoV-2 infection, but the COVID-19 is the side effects of that, having that infection. But they skewed. First of all, the test itself was incorrect because they were using something called the PCR test, and which amplifies the amount of material in there. So they have each amplification is called a CT or a cycle threshold. So they put the limit initially at 40, which is like thousands of times higher than it's supposed to be. So you get all these enormous amount of false positives. So you have all these people that are saying had the infection and dying because there was a number of people who died with the false positive test had nothing to do with the infection, but they were labeled as dying from that test. So probably more than likely, it's like could be as many as twice as many people, or half the people really didn't die of this. They died of something else, but they were it was blaming SARS-CoV-2, which is a big challenge.
Can you talk about that more? Because with the PCR test, basically with the cycles being that high, you could find pretty much some of anything and everything.
Right.
And even Kerry Mullins, the creator of the PCR test,
who passed away right as this thing started. But yeah, there's many videos of him and he got a Nobel Prize for that, so he wasn't some dumb cookie.
I want to ask this to Kerry. How do they misuse PCR to estimate all these supposed free viral RNAs that may or may not be there?
I think misuse PCR is not quite. I don't think you can misuse PCR. Actually, no, the results, the interpretation of it. See, if you can say, if they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. It's not an estimation. No, it's a really quantitative thing. tells you something about nature and about what's there, but it allows you to take a very minuscule amount of anything and make it measurable, and then talk about it in meetings and stuff like it is important. See, that's not a misuse, that's just sort of a misinterpretation. PCR is separate from that. It's just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what
Also,
it is. But it's not, it doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that. What is it? What is it about humanity that wants to go to all the details and stuff and listen? You know, these guys like Fauci get up there and start talking. You know, he doesn't know anything really about anything, and I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and stick it in an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus in there, you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and he should not be in a position like he's in. Most of those guys up there on the top are just total administrative people, and they don't know anything about what's going on the bottom. You know, those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way. They've got a personal kind of agenda. They make up their own rules as they go. They change them when they want to, and they smugly, like Tony Fauci, does not mind going on television in front of the people that pay his salary and lie directly into the camera. You can't expect the sheep to really respect the best and the brightest. They don't know the difference, really. I mean, I like humans. Don't get me wrong, but basically, the vast majority of them do not possess the ability to judge who is and who isn't a really good scientist. I mean, that's a problem. That's a main problem, actually, with science, I'd say, in this century, because science is being judged by people. Funding is being done by people who don't understand it.
He knew what he was talking about, and this test was being abused or used for nefarious purposes to essentially support the narrative. And interestingly, when Biden was inaugurated, I think January 20th or the third week of January, they changed the cycle threshold. They lowered it.
Right. That's so funny they would do that with the timing.
Yeah, and then even just interestingly now, even if you you can't die if you have with the details. If you have a COVID injection, and you
if you have a COVID infection.
Injection.
Uh-huh.
I'm hesitant to call it a vaccine because it really isn't a vaccine.
Okay.
So we call injection or jab, or shot, but don't call it a vaccine because you're falling into their trap of getting sort of the benefit. I don't think there's much benefits of vaccine, but a lot of people do believe it. And they especially ascribe to some of the first vaccines like smallpox and polio, which are almost universally agreed upon to have enormous public health benefit. But if you dive deep into it, I know that's not a topic for this conversation, but you could find a lot of flaws in those arguments. See, in my view, it's just bringing this whole fundamentally flawed perspective on how you treat disease or how you prevent disease. And anyone who's objectively studied this, and if you haven't, you can get the book because it gives you sort of a jumpstart primer on some of the basics. But if you seriously and carefully evaluate it and you're not biased, you can't not reach any other conclusion that this whole thing was staged. It was absolutely staged.
So let's talk about that, because it really starts off when you talk about this in the book. There's some big issues around it. Like, let's talk about Event 201, for example. And by the way, when you hear about, I'm sure a lot of folks listening have heard about Event 201, but it sounds like it's some fairy tale, it's some mythical thing.
Yeah.
But I just went and looked at major news sites like, Forbes, Business Wire. It was all there prior to the pandemic that this is a very real thing that took place.
It was a pretty big event, and like any big event, and if you've been involved in them, you don't schedule those the week before, right? It takes about a year to plan something like that. So even though it was only about 6 weeks before the pandemic hit, it was probably planned a year before. So what was it? It was in New York. It was sponsored by the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Bloomberg's John Hopkins School of Public Health. So you've got all these these forces that are really aligned with one specific narrative to support this whole pandemic. And it was basically an exercise, a trial. And they had newscasts that said, what are we going to do? They talked about, what do we do with the anti-vaxxers? And they talked about censorship. And they went through the whole drill. It was a drill. And they ran through it. And it was 6 weeks before, so no one had heard of this event, and no one had any clue that this was coming. But 6 weeks later, we started to get a hint. And by 12 weeks later, it was full blown. Everyone knew this was an issue, and they shut the whole darn world down.
So what was the purpose of Event 201? What were they doing?
It was a trial exercise to just make sure they fine-tuned their strategy.
For coronavirus. They use a coronavirus.
They actually, it was right. It was a lab bench exercise with the coronavirus, and they vehemently denied that it had anything to do with predicting this.
It was just super coincidental.
Yeah, just coincidental. So yeah, I mean,
it could be coincidental. I'm here to.
Sure, anything's possible.
I'm gonna play the heaven's advocate here, but so with that said, so we knew that there was a lot going on behind the scenes. Like, what if this situation happens? Mm-hmm. How do we deal with getting a vaccine to market as soon as possible? But I think the big issue here is looking at truly, regardless of even this event tie-in, and this is a big issue today, and I know you see this, even we have reductionism, not just in medicine, but in our thinking. If we find one piece that doesn't fit, we negate the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So let's get to another piece, and hopefully everybody can look at the big picture, which is now, you wrote about this in the book, and you've been talking about this since the beginning, that it was very unlikely that this was originated in nature. And now, right here as we're recording this, the CDC director at the time has come forward and said that he believes it was originated.
So Dr. Robert Redfield, the former CDC director, is speaking out for the first time, saying publicly where he believes the coronavirus that caused the pandemic came from. These extraordinary comments come in a new interview for a CNN documentary airing this weekend. Dr. Sanjay Gupta joins us now. And Sanjay, Dr. Redfield says he's giving his opinion, but I have to say, I think you're about to break some pretty significant news here.
Yeah, I mean, this was extraordinary, John, for certain. He is the former CDC director. He has spent his entire career as a virologist. I interviewed all 6 of these doctors sort of in the form of an autopsy, really to sort of meticulously dissect exactly what had happened here. Really no pre-agenda. Dr. Redfield, when we sat down to talk, he wanted to start at the beginning, the origins of this virus, what he believed actually transpired. Take a listen.
If I was to guess, this virus started transmitting somewhere in September, October in Wuhan.
September, October.
That's my own view. It's an only opinion. I'm allowed to have opinions now. I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
It is also not unusual for that type of research to be occurring in Wuhan. The city is a widely known center for viral studies in China, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has experimented extensively with bat coronaviruses.
It is a remarkable conversation I feel like we're having here, because you are the former CDC director and you were the director at the time this was all happening.
For the first time, the former CDC director is stating publicly that he believes this pandemic started months earlier than we knew, and that it originated not at a wet market, but inside a lab in China.
These are 2 significant things to say, Dr. Redfield.
And that's not implying any intentionality. It's my opinion, all right? But I am a virologist. I have spent my life in virology. I do not believe this somehow came from a bat to a human, and at that moment in time, the virus that came to the human became one of the most infectious viruses that we know in humanity for human-to-human transmission. Normally when a pathogen goes from a zoonotic to human, it takes a while for it to figure out how to become more and more efficient in human-to-human transmission. I just don't think this makes biological sense.
So in the lab, do you think that process of becoming more efficient was happening? Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, let's just say I have coronavirus that I'm working on. Most of us in the lab, we're trying to grow a virus. We try to help make it grow better and better and better and better and better and better so we can do experiments and figure out about it.
And now there's just more and more data coming in about that. And it seemed very, very obvious at the beginning.
It was very obvious. I mean, I did an interview with Francis Boyle, who's an attorney who actually wrote the biowarfare treaty that was signed by almost every country in the world. And if anyone's convicted under this treaty, they actually go to prison for the rest of their life. He's rather than being executed, he's opposed to that. But anyway, I interviewed him in like February of 2020, and he spelled out the full story that's just coming to be exposed now, like on Tucker Carlson and all these other sites, and even the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, that are exposing the things that we were talking about over a year ago. That was really, really clear. The evidence was very strong that there was gain-of-function research funded by the NIH to the tune of millions of dollars and spun off through other front groups like EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak. Interestingly, Daszak should be in prison too. I mean, this guy, but he just, they're so clever. They spun off these, basically, because they're so well planted in the academic field, they're able to get studies and letters published in very prestigious journals that are then adopted and accepted by the whole conventional community. So they spin off some lies. They spin off this paper, and it sounds respectable. But if you know any little bit of science, you can figure it out that it was just fatally flawed. It made no sense. But they got it published like in one of the most prestigious journals, Nature, and this was the paper that all the journalists and everyone were pointing to, that this positive proof that this never came out of the lab. But it did come out of the lab. I mean, it's really obvious. And now they're accepting it. And Fauci I think he's going to wind up in prison. I mean, there's a good chance, unless Biden rescues him and gives him a pardon. But I mean, they had a Freedom of Information from, I think BuzzFeed did it, and they have over 3,000 of his emails, and it was really, really clear that he was just lying. He was absolutely lying.
Can you take a step back and tell everybody what gain of function is?
Yeah, gain of function is a term used to describe techniques applied to viruses or infectious diseases to make them more infectious and more deadly. So, and the excuse for doing this research is that it's defensive, that we want to develop the resources and the strategies to understand exactly what this is so we can defend against it. But that's just an excuse, because they can use them for biowarfare. And I'm not suggesting that this was designed for biowarfare agent, but it was a gain of function. The evidence is so clear. It's beyond clear. It's irrefutable. Right. I mean, they've got HIV proteins in there that never exist in nature, and it got the spike protein. It's all the envelopes. It was just all done, and you can look. It's very if you get into the molecular biology and genetics of it, it's really, really clear. And I mean, you could read this stuff for hours, all the specific details, but the summary is it's very clear. It's gain of function research.
You went in the book and you shared multiple references on even the wet market nearby getting cleared. That was all tested. No trace of anything like this. And the evolution of a coronavirus to be able to infect humans so efficiently that quickly is so abnormal. And you go and break down so many different pieces of this. And I want to share a little snippet from one of these emails, because again, gain of function is incredibly dangerous. Like that, it's a loophole around getting something that is illegal. It's outlawed by international law, isn't it right, to create?
No, I don't know that technically it's not outlawed. The research isn't, at least is by best.
But the creation of biological weapons is what I'm saying.
Yes,
because that's what they're doing in a roundabout way.
That is outlawed. That was the whole legal framework for that was developed by Francis Boyle, who was a professor emeritus of law.
Who you?
That's why I
referenced.
Yeah.
So you talked to the guy.
Yeah, he wrote it. Yeah,
you're the guy. That's why you're the guy. So listen to this. So this is one of the emails from Fauci, and we don't like to name drop here. We don't like to make these people more famous, but at this point,
Who doesn't know Fauci though?
yeah, at this point, truly, we're not just talking about people. We're talking about larger entities that we really need to take a good look at so that we can make sure this doesn't happen again. Now, this was from an email correspondence with Fauci's deputy, Hugh Auchincloss. And Fauci says to Auchincloss, quote, "Read this paper as well as the email that I will forward you right now," end quote. Now, Hugh Auchincloss replies to Fauci saying, "The paper you sent me says the experiments were performed before the gain of function pause, but have since been reviewed and approved by NIH," unquote. Now, he says that this gain of function research was on pause. Not that we ended this, it's just pause.
No, that's not disputed. That was definitely, they did that. The NIH funded it, and I forget when, it was like 2014 or 15. Then they put it on pause because they got at this lapse of consciousness, that they shouldn't be doing this, and then it went right back forward. I think it was, I can't remember. It might have been during the Obama administration where they restarted the funding for it.
That's crazy. So we've got folks in labs who are making viruses more infectious, more deadly, more virulent, more deadly, to find a way to stop them in case it happens. But the issue is we're dealing with humans and human error. So this is more likely what we're dealing with here and looking at. And you cite in the book how the Wuhan lab had all of these issues prior that were noted by multiple countries, that this type of work is probably going to end badly coming out of this particular location.
Yeah, so it's the biosafety labs. I forget this, BSL, biosafety lab, I think is what it's called. They categorize them by 1 through 4. And I think that the Wuhan virologist was a category 4. I think it's the only one in China. I just read earlier this week, they're planning on having 25 more. I mean, it's just, China is. We've got plenty in this country. We've got probably more than 20. We have hundreds actually from 1 to 4. But plenty category 4. Fort Detrick is the primary one, and that was the BSL lab that was responsible for the anthrax, where all that the anthrax scare came out in 2001. Yeah. But it's very common for these outbreaks to occur.
Right.
I mean,
even swine flu, there's good evidence that human error is involved there as well.
Yeah. The swine flu, that brings up another one. We get to talk when we talk about the jab or the vaccine.
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it.
Swine flu vaccine.
Yeah.
You're probably, I would say, not old enough to remember that. That was in the late 70s.
Yeah, I wasn't a thought yet.
Yeah. So that, it was interesting because there wasn't as much brainwashing, and the media had some more credibility than they do today. And you could think of CBS News, which is just a total propaganda machine now, probably for the last 20 years. But at the time, in the mid-70s, you had Mike Wallace with 60 Minutes, and they did a really epic piece that is still a big, you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah, we'll play it for everybody.
Yeah,
here.
it's a classic piece because it was a really great piece of investigative journalism.
The flu season is upon us. Which type will we worry about this year? And what kind of shots will we be told to take? Remember the swine flu scare of 1976? That was the year the U.S. government told us all that swine flu could turn out to be a killer that could spread across the nation. And Washington decided that every man, woman, and child in the nation should get a shot to prevent a nationwide outbreak, a pandemic. Well, 46 million of us obediently took the shot. And now 4,000 Americans are claiming damages from Uncle Sam amounting to $3.5 billion because of what happened when they took that shot. By far the greatest number of the claims, 2/3 of them, are for neurological damage or even death, allegedly triggered by the flu shot. We pick up the story back in 1976 when the threat posed by the swine flu virus seemed very real indeed.
This virus was the cause of a pandemic in 1918 and 1919 that resulted in over 500,000 deaths in the United States, as well as 20 million deaths around the world.
See how easy it is to... Thus, the U.S. government's publicity machine was cranked into action to urge all America to protect itself against the swine flu menace.
Influenza is serious business. During major flu epidemics, millions of people are sick and thousands die. Well, this year you can get protection. The vaccines are safe, easy to take, and they can protect you against flu. So roll up your sleeve. Protect yourself.
One of those who did roll up her sleeve was Judy Roberts. She was perfectly healthy, an active woman, when in November of 1976, she took her shot. 2 weeks later, she says, she began to feel a numbness starting up her legs.
I joked about it at that time. I said I'll be numb to the knees by Friday if this keeps up. By the following week, I was totally paralyzed.
So completely paralyzed, in fact, that they had to operate on her to enable her to breathe. And for 6 months, Judy Roberts was a quadriplegic. The diagnosis? A neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS for short. These neurological diseases are little understood. They affect people in different ways. As you can see in these home movies taken by a friend, Judy Roberts' paralysis confined her mostly to a wheelchair for over a year. But this disease can even kill. Indeed, there are 300 claims now pending from the families of GBS victims who died, allegedly as a result of the swine flu shot.
The rationale for our recommendation was not on the basis of the death of a single individual, but it was on the basis that when we do see a change in the characteristics of the influenza virus, it is a massive public health problem in this country.
Dr. David Senser, then head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, is now in private industry. He devised the swine flu program, and he pushed it. You began to give flu shots to the American people in October of 76.
October 1st.
By that time, how many cases of swine flu around the world had been reported?
There had been several reported, but none confirmed. There had been cases in Australia that were reported by the press, by the news media. There were cases in...
None confirmed. Did you ever uncover any other outbreaks of swine flu anywhere in the world?
No.
Now, nearly everyone was to receive the shot in a public health facility where a doctor might not be present. Therefore, it was up to the CDC to come up with some kind of official consent form, giving the public all the information it needed about the swine flu shot. This form stated that the swine flu vaccine had been tested. What it didn't say was that after those tests were completed, the scientists developed another vaccine. And that was the one given to most of the 46 million who took the shot. That vaccine was called X53A. Was X53A ever field tested?
I can't say. I would have to...
It wasn't.
I don't know.
Well, I would think that you're in charge of the program.
I would have to check the records. I haven't looked at this in some time.
The information form, the consent form, was also supposed to warn people about any risks of serious complications following the shot. But did it?
No, I had never heard of any reactions other than a sore arm, fever, this sort of thing.
Judy Roberts' husband, Gene, also took the shot.
Yes, I looked at that document. I signed it. Nothing on there said I was going to have a heart attack or I get Guillain-Barré, which I never heard of.
What if people from the government, from the Center for Disease Control, what if they had indeed known about it? What would be your feeling?
They should have told us.
Did anyone ever come to you and say, you know something, fellas? There's the possibility of neurological damage if you get into a mass immunization program?
No.
No one ever did?
No.
Do you know Michael Hapwick?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Michael Hapwick directed the surveillance team for the swine flu program at the CDC. His job was to find out what possible complications could arise from taking the shot and to report his findings to those in charge. Did you know ahead of time, Dr. Hapwick, that there had been case reports of neurological disorders, neurological illness, apparently associated with the injection of influenza vaccine?
Absolutely.
You did?
Yes.
How'd you know that?
By review of the literature.
So you told your superiors, the men in charge of the swine flu immunization program, about the possibility of neurological disorders?
Absolutely.
What would you say if I told you that your superiors say that you never told them about the possibility of neurological complications?
That's nonsense. I can't believe that they would say that they did not know that there were neurological illnesses associated with influenza vaccination. That simply is not true. We did know that.
I've said that Dr. Hatwick had never told me of his feelings on this subject.
And he's lying.
I guess you would have to make that assumption.
Then why does this report from your own agency, dated July 1976, list neurological complications as a possibility?
I think the consensus of the scientific community was that the evidence relating neurologic disorders to influenza immunization, that they did not feel that this association was a real one.
You didn't feel it was necessary to tell American people that information?
I think that over the years we have tried to inform the American people as fully as possible.
But anyway, I think it might have been Ford that was the president during the time. I think it was, but I could be wrong. It might be Carter. But they had this epidemic of swine flu, and they were really nervous. They thought millions of people were going to die. So the president or the government authorized and encouraged the use of everyone getting this vaccine. And about 50 million people got the vaccine. Now, this was in the late 70s, I think 76, 77. And this was years before they passed the 1986 Acts, which essentially provided liability from immunity from prosecution from the vaccine manufacturers. So they were still liable, but they said, no problem, the government will pick up the bill. If there's any problems, we'll pay for it, right? This is an important point. So they did. Now, they had immunized 50 million people, and then they stopped it. Because how many people do you think died from it?
Just how many? Tell me.
50.
50 people.
50 people. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but it's still 50 people. Yeah. And there were, I think, hundreds, if not thousands of people came to develop neurodegenerative diseases like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is happening now from the swine or the COVID jab. So 50 people died. And what did the government do? They stopped the program. They immediately stopped the swine flu immunization program. Paid out over $3.5 billion in damages. The government paid. Taxpayer money.
Right.
All right? And if you watch that 60 Minutes interview with 60 Minutes, I mean, he did an enormous job of investigative journalism and really chastised the people in the CDC and the people who were in charge of this and just showed how fraudulent the whole thing was. All right, so that was 75. So fast forward at like 50 years, right? Just about 50 years.
Look, very different.
We have this threat, and this immunization program comes out, this shot. They, as we're taping this or recording this, we have 6,000 deaths reported into the VAERS database. The VAERS database is notoriously underreported. Estimates are from 99 to 90%, so that means not 6,000, but 60,000 to 600,000 deaths. Do you think they're stopping the program? No.
Wow.
You know what they're doing? They're bribing the public. They're giving lotteries of $5 million to get the vaccine.
Yeah. Here in California, there's like 100 million in lottery and gifts and all these different things. Yeah.
And the government's paying, interestingly, about the same amount that they wound up paying in damages for the swine flu. $3.5 billion is being paid by the government, taxpayer money, for commercials for the COVID jab.
Because pharmaceutical companies can't legally do ads for it. It's not FDA approved.
That may be the case.
But there's loopholes. They use, like you talk about in the book as well, they use marketing firms to be able to do the work for them.
So this is important to know, and we can go into a lot more details. I believe I'm well studied on the vaccine, so I can tell you the molecular biology of the concerns why this is such a tragic thing. Because there is no question, there is not a micro doubt in my mind, this will inevitably kill far more people than COVID ever did. There's no way. And we've already had the 6,000 to 60,000 at a bare minimum, maybe over 100,000. And that's acutely. But we're talking that's acute deaths, but then you've got near term, which is going to come this fall. You're going to have another wave of people dying from it, and then the long-term deaths, because this is a prion disease. They are injecting. This injection is essentially a metabolic poison, probably worse than vegetable oil. And they're causing your body to continue to make it. They're giving your body a set of instructions to make a toxic protein. Do you think that SARS-CoV, this coronavirus or COVID protein, not COVID protein, the coronavirus spike protein is a poison? Why would you want to put it in your body, let alone give your body instructions to make this thing, maybe for years, if not the rest of your life?
We don't know. That's the thing. We don't
know.
No
one knows. No one knows.
But there's this sense of certainty out there in the media and with health professionals that we know.
It's because it's all been engineered. 100% this is an engineered process. And why did we have this pandemic? There's some really strong, compelling arguments. The only intention for it was to get everyone to take the vaccine. That was the purpose.
So around the mid-1970s, swine flu hit the scene. The vaccine hit the scene shortly after. Then it was stopped after just 50 folks lost their lives. And eventually panned out to be a couple hundred who lost their lives in association. Billions of dollars paid out. Now we've got thousands of people who've lost their lives in association with the vaccine. And
I don't call it a vaccine. The injection.
Okay,
COVID
the
injection.
mRNA injection.
Yeah.
And everything is rolling as strong as ever. And there's I think a big issue and why I'm so grateful to have you here is that we don't have that other reference point for folks to realize like, yeah, wait a minute, there is a risk associated with this. But I think folks, before we get back into the vaccine, they're more concerned about the risk associated with COVID versus the vaccine. It's just like, well, if I can reduce my risk.
That's
so
the
talk about that.
invisible boogeyman. So, if you're a rational, logical individual, human being living in this 21st century in the United States, then that's an understandable response, because you've been brainwashed. Everything you hear on conventional media is to drive one of the most powerful limbic responses in your body, which is fear. Everything supports that. That's why you're afraid of this. And they know what drives you to action. It's fear, the most powerful limbic emotion. So that's why you're afraid of it, because you've been brainwashed with propaganda. You have not anything that counters that narrative is removed. It's censored. It's eliminated. And if you do it persistently, then you're deplatformed. You're buried. That information that you need to tell you the other side is absolutely suppressed. You cannot find it in the Google search engine, which is 92% of the searches on the planet are Google. If anything that supports telling a different view, you cannot find it. It doesn't exist. It's the perfect strategy, because it used to be the best search engine on the planet. And it still is for many searches. It provides incredibly useful, powerful information that can change your life. But when they want to promote something, they manipulate it in a way that essentially continues with the brainwashing.
So the same thing, as you mentioned, and we can get into the censorship of information in a moment, but I want to talk about some of the
important.
data.
This
is important, of course.
Yeah, it's not because of individuals it's just the information, the truth is suppressed and you can't find it.
Yeah. So again, you just said it, rational, concerned citizen here in the United States, being exposed to what we're exposed to, we would obviously lean towards, let me get this vaccination because it's going to protect me, versus this very virulent thing. But in the book, you really bring forth the real numbers on this. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because, so for example, the risk and where this is really being pushed, even in younger populations, the risk there is substantially lower than what the environment would lead us to believe.
Yeah, and if you carefully review even the propaganda, they won't deny that. They'll.
You're right.
But it's phrased in a way to confuse you. But there's very little risk for younger people and certainly children. And there are so many crimes against humanity being committed here. To have Fauci say that by the end of the year he wants kids 6 months and old being injected. when there is virtually no risk. There may have been 100, maybe 200 kids in the entire country that have died from this. I mean, it is so far down the list. I mean, there's like 20 more higher causes of death than that. It's a non-significant issue. The odds are, it's all about a risk to reward ratio. What's the risk? What's the reward? The risk is almost insignificant from the disease. The reward or the benefit for protecting it is almost non-existent. So why would you give them, what's the risk of the injection? It's enormous. It's crazy. It's through the roof. And they can't, they have no evidence, no proof. There's never been any safety study. This is, they divide vaccines in a number of different categories. And this injection that they're calling, that they classify as a vaccine, which it isn't, but it is in the category of an unprecedented vaccine. That means it never existed before. Other examples of that would be HIV and malaria. Okay, so the normal, and this is well established, this is right in the literature, right? Normally it takes 12 to 15 years to bring an unprecedented vaccine to market. 12 to 15 years. They did this in less than a year. There are no safety studies. There are fake safety studies that have been destroyed because even the fake safety studies that they did they canceled the controls, so they don't exist anymore. They're burying the evidence so that they can't ever claim that they knew. And even in these fake studies that they used, there were no pregnant women involved in the trial. None. Zero. Why? Because that would be foolish. Why would you ever think of exposing a pregnant woman to some experimental process, right? You couldn't do that. You couldn't do that in all good conscience, right? But what did they do like a month ago or so? CDC came out and said, "Oh, we think the risk outweigh the benefits outweigh the risk, and all pregnant women should be given the COVID jab," which causes a lot of premature deaths and miscarriages.
The question would come up: how would pharmaceutical companies do this? Why would they do something like that? We should have laws against that. Well, here we've got Johnson & Johnson.
It's called the Nuremberg Code.
We'll put this up for everybody to see on the screen. But here we've got a report: Johnson & Johnson and 3 other companies close in on a $26 billion deal on opioid litigation. Mm-hmm. We've got Johnson & Johnson to pay more than $2.2 billion to resolve criminal and civil investigations. This was reported by the Department of Justice. We've got another report from the Department of Justice with Pfizer to pay $2.3 billion for fraudulent marketing, and that's the largest healthcare fraud settlement in history of the Department of Justice. Then we've got Pfizer paying about $75 million over illegally testing drugs on Nigerian children. We've got Pfizer paying over $1 billion to settle Primpro for causing breast cancer in women. We've got study after study after study.
They're criminals. They're convicted criminals. These are criminal organizations. Why would anyone who's rational believe that these criminal organizations have you just cited billions of dollars in awarded fines and penalties for doing this? Why would we believe them? They look at this as just a cost of doing business. Yeah. And I believe Pfizer is targeted to make somewhere between $25 and $30 billion in 2021.
Just them alone.
Yeah.
The entire market, they're looking at at least $100 billion.
Yeah.
For all these different companies. So Johnson & Johnson's quote debt that they got to pay for the opioid crisis they contributed to, they're just going to wipe that right from their ledger with these vaccines and without liability. And that's the big thing.
Yeah, and there's actually several layers of it. They had the 1986 Act, which provided them immunity, but then they got in, I think, the PrEP Act, which further insulated them. I mean, you just can't. You have no resource. There's a woman who was read about who nearly died from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Had a whole variety of, and she's going to be permanently crippled. $1 million in medical bills. She has to pay for it.
That's crazy.
She has to pay for it.
That is so crazy.
When you hear about a single individual, think about it. Your relative, your loved one comes down with, almost dies and has $1 million in bills. No liability, nothing. Just so they could make $100 billion.
The worst part about this, and it's a consistent behavior. So I just shared some of the reports. There's so many of these. Is how difficult it is. These are the rare moments. Mm-hmm. These are the 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 50,000 where they get caught, because it's so hard to prove that they committed a crime, because they've got the most powerful legal team on planet Earth who are able to really sweep so much of this stuff under the rug that you never even hear about. And so when I'm sharing these big numbers and billions of dollars, it's literally the cost of doing business. It's scraps to them. They put it into their accounting like, yeah, we're going to kill some people. It's all good, but we're going to focus on getting these drugs into as many people's body as possible. And with vaccines, it's really a cash cow because there's no liability. So they already had some immunity, but now with the PERT, you just mentioned, is it PrEP? I'm sorry, with the PrEP, now they have further immunity, and I think it's until like 2024 when any kind of litigation can even be attempted towards any kind of harm that they've done. And you just mentioned this, so we've got at least 6,000 folks have lost their lives. People need to know that.
And that's right now.
Yeah.
We're not even we're not into the summer yet.
And that's not even talking about the injuries. Right. Potentially devastating.
And the deaths to come in the fall and a lot down the road.
And this is what I want to ask you about next. There's actually two things. So let's talk a little bit about because you keep on hesitating and shifting away from calling this a vaccine. So let's talk about what it is, and let's talk a little bit about what it can potentially be doing in our bodies, because I know that there's new data is now out that the spike protein appears to be a big causative agent in the negative reactions in the first place. And this is causing your body to make that spike protein.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is what the whole issue is about. So, well, it's as everyone's heard of it, it's messenger RNA. There's two different versions, the Moderna and the Pfizer version. Then the Johnson & Johnson is a different. It's essentially is a genetic instruction set, but it's administered through an adenovirus vector. So it's a little bit different. Some people thought it's safer, but it depends on your clinical history. It could be a lot more dangerous, a lot worse. But essentially, they've changed the whole definition, because this would have never been considered a vaccine. It isn't. It is a gene treatment, and essentially, messenger RNA is similar to DNA, except it's there's some finer differences, but it's essentially the instruction set that is generated by the DNA to cause your body to make specific proteins. It's not just spike proteins. It's every protein in your body is made through this process. But this messenger RNA is very fragile, highly fragile. And many people know these vaccines had to be refrigerated at like really cold temperatures, colder than it was at the poles, and because it's so perishable. But this spike protein that they're causing your body to make, the spike protein, it's not the same protein that the SARS-CoV-2 makes.
Right.
It's not.
It can't be.
It's not.
Yeah.
Hardly anyone understands this. They engineered it. This is a genetically engineered, similar to SARS-CoV-2, but completely different. How is it different? Well, at the most fundamental level, there's 4 nucleotides in messenger RNA, or RNA in general. One of them is uridine. It's a substitute for thymidine, which is in DNA. The other 3 are the same. So they took this uridine, they swapped out all the uridines in this RNA to methyl pseudouridine, because it's more resistant to breaking down by these RNases, these enzymes that destroy RNA. So totally different from that perspective. But here's another one that's perhaps even more important. The spike protein, one of the reasons why it's so dangerous is it attaches to this receptor on your cells called ACE2. And when it attaches, it kind of knocks it out of commission, which causes a lot of problems in your body. Just when you have the regular SARS-CoV-2 protein, the spike protein, it goes in, attaches to the ACE2 receptor, and then it collapses. The protein collapses and it gets engulfed into the cell, and it causes its own challenges. But this engineered one, they substituted 2 different amino acids, 2 prolines, which makes it really firm and rigid, so that when it attaches to the ACE2 receptor, it doesn't collapse. It just stays open. essentially knocking out that ACE2 receptor, which radically increases its toxicity and damage. Increases to things like primarily clotting disorders, blood clots, ITP, idiopathic thrombocytic purpura, and all these other clotting challenges that really lead to many of these complications like strokes, and can cause heart inflammation, myocarditis, a whole variety of other things. But anyway, this spike protein gets set in, and then you would think, well, no, it's going to just come in and make it and it disappears. No, we have no idea how long. No one knows how long it lives. They're guessing 6 months, but because it's so genetically modified, it may stick around for a lot longer in your tissues, continuing your body to produce these spike proteins. But it gets even worse. Because normally RNA is not transmitted down to your progeny, right? And so I think there's not an issue. But it turns out that your cells have this reverse transcriptase enzymes, which actually converts that RNA back to DNA. And you've got the DNA floating, and it gets integrated into your own DNA. So now you have the code in your DNA to make spike proteins that you can pass on to all your kids. If that doesn't want to make you...
But Dr. Mercola, that's been debunked.
No, it hasn't.
That's been debunked.
It has not been debunked. That is not true. The evidence is really clear. There's
the fact checkers say it doesn't affect your DNA.
Yeah, that's baloney. That is absolute baloney. One of my...
And it's like, this is basic stuff too. It's basic stuff. And it just seems like, again, like it's fact checked as if it's not. Even if we talk about, so it doesn't affect your genes, what about all that we know about epigenetics and epigenetic influences? Of course, it affects.
But that could be, I mean, there can be huge epigenetic influence, but this is at the genetic level.
Yeah.
It's
just
frightening.
every single level, there's things that we know that are just being ignored, is my point. And so with this being said, and the big takeaway here, and I just want to reiterate this, we don't know long-term. We simply don't. It doesn't exist. There's no long-term evidence. And this getting pushed to market so quickly with this emergency use access, something that was also put in very recently in a litigation to be even available for the public to do in the first place. Yeah. But so now, there's a major campaign, a lot of folks just trying to get back to some form of life again, to be able to see their loved ones, to be able to work. But now, and this very on, and you've even shared data on this, prior to the vaccine even being in existence, it was leading towards making it mandatory, making it so that you're going to need this, quote, passport in order for you to travel, in order for you. And it seemed, even when it was all happening, when it's coming out, a lot of people in the health space were like, nah, that would never happen. They would never require you to do that just to go to a concert. But it's unfolding like that.
It seems to be. I think thankfully, there's been some very, I don't know if the best term progressive, but open-minded governors in the United States. There's been 11 that actually have passed legislation, Florida being one of them, not California,
where you live,
where they banned these vaccine passports.
Yeah.
So that's put I think an unexpected hurdle in their face, and I don't see it rapidly going forward. I was really concerned and dismayed that it was going to, but it looks like it put a real hurdle in their path, and it doesn't seem to be going like we thought it was going to, which is good. So I want to get back to the issue with the financial incentives and the drug companies. Well, you got to wonder, because this gets into the deeper reasons, and I didn't really appreciate this until recently. Who owns the drug companies? Who owns the drug companies? Like no one knows this. There's two organizations that owns the vast majority of everything. Do you know what those two organizations are? BlackRock and Vanguard. They own almost all of it. So then who's behind BlackRock? That's pretty much it's a public organization, so you can see who those people are. But one of the biggest shareholders of BlackRock is Vanguard. That's private. We don't know who those are. But those people in Vanguard, those are the people that are calling the shots. That's behind this whole mess. Because, yeah, these drug companies are making money, but who collects the money? Who collects the money? You know, it's not like there's Mr. Pfizer is getting a bit, Mr. Moderna, you know, so it's owned by these other organizations. And now Gates is clearly one of them. There's no question. I mean, fortunately, he's being in the process of being exposed. His halo is rapidly disappearing, as is Fauci's. He's being exposed. So, I mean, his divorce didn't help.
Yeah. Bill and sort of Melinda Gates Foundation now.
I think that may have been a strategic move on his part to transfer the halo to Melinda.
Yeah.
And save what his strategy was.
One of the most revealing things that I took away from your book, like I didn't know the magnitude, and you really broke down, because obviously we know, you know, Bill Gates as being like, we just think he's just this super nerd who's like smart and, you know, he's got his sweater vest on, he's behind computers. But there was a shift that took place, and he became really big in philanthropy. But you detail all of the financial benefits that likely encouraged that change to take place in the very beginning.
Well, it's a very effective strategy. You know, I live in a place in Florida where John Rockefeller spent the end of his life, and he wound up dying there, literally about a mile from where I live. And he was absolutely villainized even more than Gates was. And I'm talking about Gates pre-2000, you know, like when he was running Microsoft and he was on trial by the Department of Justice for things. And you can just watch his testimony. It's sad to see this guy rocking it. And he was virtually no one liked that guy. But then he followed the strategy of what Rockefeller did. And they were pretty similar. And it's a very effective strategy, is to become a philanthropist. And, you know, ostensibly donating these massive amounts of wealth and changing the public perception. And you're right. What you said is what the view that most people have, because after 2 decades of doing that, it really was effective. But when you dive deep into what he's doing, you'll see that many of these ostensibly philanthropic humanitarian benefits are only for his benefit and wind up killing tens, hundreds of thousands of people. Or he's had these immunization programs in India or Africa that decimated the population. And I think
he's essentially been like outlawed.
Yeah, he's been banned. He's been banned.
It's so crazy. People have no idea about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so aside from the Vanguard and BlackRock, there's two. This is a tangent to the reason why people don't know, because there's 2 advertising agencies, Publicis and Omnicom, that have like over 95% of all the advertising runs through them, which controls in large part what you're hearing in the media. So if you've got 2 big organizations running everything, you know, this is the epitome of centralization, which is just a tragic disaster. When you put all the power in one place, you can't have anything but a bad effect. And unfortunately, that seems to be the tendency and the trajectory that most countries and sources of power kind of go to.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why we get into this. I mean, we have such a massive financial bubble that's going to explode and collapse at some point, because it's all centralized. All these central banks in the world, you know, there's printing money like there's no end in sight. And you can do that for a while, but eventually it just collapses.
Yeah. So you shared his, you know, using the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation being a great shield for his wealth, and being able to just kind of strategically move money around, and also the tax protection. The list goes on and on. You detail that. But one of the things that jumped out at me, and this is what I want to ask you about, I was shocked to find out how many grants they give to the media.
Yeah.
It just like, and then it just
absolutely.
all made sense.
Like the BBC, the Guardian, and all these relatively.
How is that even possible? Like how is that even allowed?
It's tremendous. It's a tremendous leverage. So relatively minor investment, he can control the media and the perception. So they're never going to print anything adverse to counter to what he wants them to do.
And then you think like all of this stuff is coming out. Then you think also, for me, I was just like, what is already strategic? What are they allowing for them to put out in the media about him and his character, whatever? So we've got that piece, and also the pharmaceutical industry invests somewhere around $5 billion a year on major media as well, at least.
Yeah.
You know, so again, you think who's controlling the messaging?
I think it might be, it's called DTC, or direct to consumer advertising. And I think it's close to 15 or 16 billion on direct to consumer. And then another 5 or 10 goes to doctors to brainwash them. Now, being a physician, I was part of that process. I mean, I haven't seen patients in over a decade. But, you know, when I was practicing, they would come give you dinners and all these bribes and pizzas and everything else to try to influence you, and to give you honorariums or have you speak. I was a paid speaker for the drug companies in the mid '80s.
Wow.
They used to fly me around, and at the time, my focus was on estrogen replacement therapy, which I thought was so great because it was like preventing osteoporosis and stuff. And little did I know that it was just the most crazy thing. It's killing more people than helping them. So I learned my lesson. I finally understood it a little bit later, well before the more definitive trials were published in the early 2000s. It kind of tore open the fantasy on that thing. And you had mentioned that Prempro, I don't know who got, but you mentioned the statistics on that one earlier.
Yeah, that was
Pfizer. Pfizer with $1 billion.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you know, and also with Moderna, for example, that's the other one. Most folks don't realize they've never had a profitable quarter in their history. They've been trying to make vaccines for years.
Yeah.
And because of this opportunity opening up, they're now, of course, they're on track to make billions, and they're turning their first profitable quarter ever. And one of their leading guys, let me look up his name actually. And a little fun fact here, which is not so fun. One of the board members of Moderna, Monsif Slaoui, is that right? Slaoui?
Close. It's not quite, but it's close.
He resigned from Moderna to head up the U.S. government's Project Warp Speed, while hanging on to about $10 million in stock options with Moderna. Clearly a conflict of interest here. And now he's just made a buttload of money. And more recently, Monsif was fired from his position at GSK for sexual harassment allegations. And just like you see this kind of consistent behavior, but also you see folks getting in government opportunities and just being able to rake in a lot of money, basically writing their own checks. You know, and again, if we look at the actual effectiveness of the vaccine, we talked about this prior to us getting rolling. And, you know, the title of the paper, and we'll put this for everybody to see on the video and in the show notes. The title of the paper, peer-reviewed journal, Outcome Reporting Bias in COVID-19 mRNA Vaccine Trials, finding that Pfizer's absolute risk reduction is 0.7%. Not 7%, not 70, less than 1%.
Well, they claimed it was 95%.
Right, because they're using the relative risk, which is used, that's just a clinical number, right? Kind of really using trial against trial.
Do the same thing with statins, too.
And so with Moderna, 1.1 absolute risk reduction, 1.1% absolute risk reduction. Absolute risk reduction is your risk reduction as an individual in the world.
But for what? The risk, was the risk? The risk wasn't of dying. The risk was having less symptoms.
Mild symptoms. You have a 1.1% chance of mild symptoms.
Having less symptoms.
And yet this is glorified as the saving grace, this genius invention by humans all coming together. But it's coming together under the guise that health can be found through this synthetic modality. Matter of fact, new, experimented, and I'm going to ask you about this because a physician friend of mine was like, well, this isn't new. The mRNA if everybody's not watching the video, you see Mercola's eyes look at me. They said that this is not a new technology. This has been done for years. What do you say to that?
Well, it's never been done in humans.
There you go.
That's for damn sure. So, yeah, it's just a nightmare. Because here's the whole thing. We didn't talk about it much, but you know, there's other than that, everyone's afraid because of the risk, the perceived risk. You know, the propagandized risk. Well, you don't have to be because your body is more than able to take care of this thing and effectively. So you can prevent it by being insulin sensitive, which means that what do? Well, you use something called time restricted eating, or TRE, where you're not eating more than 12 hours a day. You're eating like 6 hours a day. You kind of work your way slowly to that. And that just doing that, not even changing the food you're eating, will help tremendously. Getting rid of vegetable oils. Making sure your vitamin D level is good. So, you know, ideally the sunshine. I haven't swallowed vitamin D in over 10 years, my vitamin D level is in the optimal range. But most people aren't going to be able to walk on the beach every day like I do. So then you're going to swallow some vitamin D. Take 8,000 units. It's one of the least expensive supplements on the market. And you get your blood level tested. So you do those 3 things, you're going to be immune. So what if you still do those things and you get sick? What the heck are you going to do? Take the vaccine? No. No, there's something called nebulized hydrogen peroxide. I think I talk about it in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my favorite. And sadly, there's many really good natural medicine physicians who don't really appreciate or understand this, but I think it's the most potent intervention, not only for SARS-CoV-2, but for any viral upper respiratory infection. And even more importantly, if done on a regular basis, can help optimize your gut microbiome. So it's a simple thing. You get a nebulizer. The nebulizer is about $70, $80, and you've got it. It maybe last a decade or 20 or 30 years. I don't know. I mean, it's not something you have to buy every year. It's not a big consumable. And the consumable is hydrogen peroxide, food grade ideally, without stabilizers. And you probably pick up a bottle like a pint for $20. You put it in your refrigerator and it's good for the whole year. And you just make a little solution out of that to dilute it down because it's, want 12%, like 0.1% is virtually no side effects. There are no side effects. I never heard, if you take it at the right dose, and it obliterates the virus and upregulates your immune system. So you've got this magic bullet that you can use. And if that doesn't work, there's a lot of other things you can use. I mean, if you wanted to use the drugs, hydroxychloroquine, we got ivermectin, but you got other things like quercetin, zinc, melatonin. Those are really powerful.
Let's talk about melatonin.
Yeah.
How does that play into this?
Well, it seems to decrease the inflammatory components and it optimizes your circadian rhythm and taking it at the right time. So it seems to be a powerful strategy. And virtually no side effects with that either. I mean, it's kind of like vitamin B12. The way that you die from vitamin B12 is you drown in a bathtub of it. You just can't overdose on it.
So I want to make sure that, because I'm hearing that the nebulizer might be the top thing for you.
From my perspective, it is. Yeah. And so how are you going to do it? And because I've done hours of video interviews on this, and so unfortunately we were forced to take down the information from our site for some personal threats, but we've got it up on BitChute. So you can just go to BitChute, which they don't censor. And you can just type in my last name, Mercola, and peroxide, and you'll come up with a bunch of videos and shows you how to do it.
Great. That's great. Thank you. We'll put that in the show notes for everybody too. I want to ask you about this because, I just mentioned, and again,
when you do that, you don't have to worry.
Yeah.
So there's fear. Okay, it's okay to be afraid. It's a totally normal response to what you've been told. But then you have these tools that can address the fear far more effectively than anything that the conventional people can throw at you.
Yeah, we want people to be empowered, and you've been such a pioneer in helping us to do that, to take back control of our health. Is your mantra, and I want to ask you about this because I get to ask you, and I'm so grateful to have you here, about the things that pop up in people's minds. Mm-hmm. We have a real big, I think the biggest issue that we're facing today is missing the point. Like, that's the biggest epidemic. And so when we have numbers, for example, I just shared that the absolute risk reduction for the Pfizer vaccine, you as an individual, is less than 1%. But we are guaranteed 100% that vaccine is going to do something to you that you have no idea what's going to happen.
No one does.
Right? So we know this for certain, right?
Honestly say they have any concept of what it's going to do.
So with this being said, and we know that, again, and by the way, that risk reduction is for mild symptoms, not a risk reduction in death, not a risk reduction in any of that.
Or even getting the infection, which, there's a lot of confusion on that.
Now, since the campaign has started, and this is what I want to ask you, we've seen a drop in cases. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you a couple of things, because for me, it just so happens that this is towards the end of like the cold and flu season when all of this is taking place. It's a natural drop. The virus being more endemic at this point. Mm-hmm. And also, is there anything else why is it, because again, a physician friend of mine was like, Well, clearly it's working because the
Oh yeah,
cases
they
have
did
dropped.
the same thing with other vaccines too. If you look at the incidence of many of these infectious diseases of childhood, the incidence was already down by 90%. They throw the vaccine on there. Oh yeah, it's the magic of the vaccine. Same thing here. But interestingly, it's not the same, because if you look at the distribution of the cases after the vaccine was implemented, the cases actually increased for a few weeks. So the vaccine, the injection, the COVID injection, the COVID jab caused an increase. And then it started coming down. So it actually made it worse.
And also coincidentally, the change in the PCR.
Oh yeah, and they changed definition, right?
So all of these things coming together because,
But I don't think
and that's also, this is observational data too. When we say, okay, this happened, so like clearly this thing is working. That's not clinical evidence. That's observation. And that shouldn't be used to justify our behavior at this point where we are with science. So, well, there's another, again, I think that probably the biggest takeaway for me from your book, and I think it should be the biggest takeaway for all of us, is what do we do when we're faced with these kind of challenges? So you already mentioned some things we do as an individual, but some of the things that were put in place are potentially creating far lasting damage that, not potentially, they are, that we don't even know the scale of yet. So
Yeah.
when all of this took place, our constitutional rights, we gladly forfeited them. Many of us,
Well,
initially,
gladly, they were-
let me say this, initially, for a couple of weeks, we distanced, wore masks, stayed away from our loved ones, but then that behavior has been widespread and it's lasted for well over a year. Things are not even, quote, officially open up here in the state of California yet. So I want to ask you about this, about the things that were implemented, the mandates with physical distancing, for example. What are the ramifications of that? Was that the right thing to do?
No way. There was no scientific justification for it at all. None. Zero. Nada. Either for mask or for social
Then why
distancing.
did we do that?
Because it was part of the narrative to create more fear. The fear sells the vaccines, or the desire to get the vaccines. So that's part of the whole strategy, and gradual elimination of personal freedoms and liberties, and a shift towards more global tyranny.
You know this as well, because the reason that this was implemented was the WHO had some influence in this as well. But China shut everything down and their cases plummeted, right? The cases and deaths just stopped. But they changed their case definition as well. And we changed ours to make cases easier. They changed theirs for their cases to be harder. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because that was what we used as a reason to shut everything down.
Yeah, it was all engineered. They changed the definitions. They changed the definition of what it, and once the deaths started dropping last year, then all of a sudden there was a transition. It wasn't about deaths anymore. It was about cases.
Right.
And they made cases seem like that was the new deaths. And the cases are up. I mean, they just seamlessly transitioned between the two because they were already hyped up about deaths. Deaths were really the only thing that matters. And the deaths were seriously inflated, as we discussed earlier, because there were so many false positives and all the comorbidities. Even the CDC said 96% of the people who died with COVID-19 had existing comorbidities. Yeah. So it means only 4%.
An average of 4 comorbidities.
Right, average 4 comorbidities.
And or additional cause of death, right.
So, and it's not surprising, actually. Even if there wasn't this misrepresentation and bastardization of reality, you're still going to have a lot of that. But they just exploded it beyond belief. And it's all about changing the definitions. Changing it from definition of a death to the definition of a case, which it doesn't matter. Patient's not sick. And then this whole concept of, the asymptomatic positive carrier is a threat. Really, really. And we have to lock them down. It's never been done in the history of the world before. Yeah. Where you're isolating asymptomatic people. They were only supposed to isolate symptomatic people because that's when you're infectious. You're having symptoms.
Yeah. It's crazy. So what do we have to look forward to here now? We've got a lot to change. I believe in miracles. I think it's going to take a miracle to fix some of this stuff.
But I don't know. It's a good question. We don't know. We don't know what to expect other than to recognize that the vast majority, I'm convinced the majority of the population does not agree or believe anything we've talked about today. So that most likely a large portion of your friends, family, and relatives are going to be disagreeing with you, and you're going to have the evidence. But to just, just to understand that this is really a threat to your personal freedoms and liberties. And that if you really want to understand something, you can go to sites that are more difficult to find, but they're out there. And I'm certainly not the only one. There's many, many really good investigative journalists who are exposing the truth, and a lot of channels where you can find them. So if you're interested, you have to dig a little harder, but it's there. It's just have to look in different places. So ultimately, I think the solution is going to be a shift from centralized sources of power and finances. So that means things like, because one of the biggest reasons for this implementation of this whole strategy is a shift of the wealth, the transfer of their assets of the world to these BlackRock and Vanguard. So one of the ways that you can limit that personally is to make investments into decentralized resources like Bitcoin, which is, many people think it's speculative, and it is. There's certainly a speculative nature to it, but at its foundation, it really is one of the only major hopes I see of escaping the financial craziness of the global tyranny. Because there's no other. I mean, that's where they get you. It's all in the finances. So it really is a major vote for freedom. Yeah. So I mean, there's a really but Bitcoin is not something you buy and trade. Like you're going to make 10% this week or something. No, it's something you hold for the future. It's like 5 or 10 years, and it essentially allows you to be in a position where you can't be manipulated. Because ultimately, if they do implement some variant of these vaccine passports, they're going to control that, and they're going to encourage your behavior to do certain things. And one of the ways they do this is control with your finances and your bank accounts and stuff. And then they can do that. And if you have a decentralized asset, they're not able to do that at all. So you're insulated from that. So that's one. And I think ultimately, as a derivative of that, and I've been involved with computers for a long time. I've obviously got a very well visited website because I was an early adopter of the internet. I remember when I first came out with my newsletter, I was pleading with my patients to get my free newsletter. I'll email it to you. Email? It's like 5% of my patients had email, and they thought the internet was useless. But it was so clear to me that it was going to be an incredible resource, and it is. Unfortunately, it's been taken over and sort of captured would be the best term by forces that really don't want the good to come out of it. But intrinsically, it has a lot to offer if it was decentralized. So I think that's the movement. It's in the process of happening. Even Jack Dorsey has got something called Blue Sky, which is a derivative of Twitter that he's working on. So but I think ultimately that's going to be the case. But in my view, just as clear the internet was in the late 1990s, it's just as every bit as clear that cryptocurrencies are going to replace the entire financial system. So, and I know that may sound hyperbolic, but I believe it's true. And you can't do a superficial assessment of this unless what the media is telling you, like they lied to you about COVID. So you'd have to put in like 1,000 hours to come of independent study, which is a lot easier to do in crypto than it is in COVID-19. But when you put in 1,000 hard hours, then you'll come to the same conclusion. Anyone who seriously studies it, there's no other rational conclusion that you can reach, just because of the fundamentals. Like you can't really go and compress 1,000 hours into 2 or 3 minutes, but it's there, and all you have to do is study it, and you'll realize that. So that would be a thing, personally, that you could do. So because it could get a lot worse, and it may get a lot worse, and really the finances are key. But to have something that you can be insulated from what they want to do to you is going to be very powerful.
Right, yeah. And also insulating our mind. It's the last thing I want to ask you about. I want everybody, if anything, the degree to which you understand or agree with the topics we've covered today, the big thing that I want folks to take away, regardless of our perspective or where we're coming from, is to just pay attention to where our information is coming from,
Mhm.
and look at who's behind it.
Mhm.
Because, you know, at the very beginning of all of this, the WHO was a big driving force.
Still is.
For the mandate, right, for the recommendations on how we're handling these things. And can you talk about who's funding the WHO and has so much influence over what's happening with that?
Well, it used to be the United States until Trump changed that, and I think Biden put the funding back. But you know, it was Bill Gates, and he's cleverly aligned himself with that organization for like almost the last 2 decades. So, and the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum, and they're aligned pretty closely too, and even to the current president of the World Health Organization, Tedros, an interesting guy from Libya. I forget where he's. No, it's not Libya, but he did some interesting things in that country. So he's like really the first non-medical professional. He's the head of the World Health Organization, which is like crazy. But he's essentially a puppet and a pawn for the real people who pull the strings, and Gates being one of them. You know, because he funds them either directly or indirectly through a lot of his organizations, because that's the way he does it. He has front groups, and there's one front group that he has, which is the Center for Digital Hate. I don't know if you've heard of them in the UK. Yeah, they've targeted me and 11 others as the disinformation dozen about vaccines. So.
Yeah, then the disinformation does it.
Yeah, I'm the leader.
Oh, of course.
I'm the head honcho in that.
You're the boss that everybody meets,
Yeah.
the last level.
Yeah, because the criticism is that I'm doing all this for the money. Yeah, right. So
people don't understand.
You take up an anti-vaccine position. There's what? So you can sell vitamin D, which is the cheapest supplement that's on the market.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't work that way. You just get criticism hurled at you, and you know, you get deplatformed. I mean, you only do this if you really care about people.
Yeah. Like, why would you want to be controversial? Like, why would you want?
I mean, you can make an argument why you would want to be. I mean,
okay, yeah, there are some people.
Not being controversial is actually a good strategy, but when it comes to life and death,
right,
which I believe this is life and death scenario. So,
yeah.
But I'm willing to. I mean, the average person in this country, we have such a privilege of living in freedom and liberty that most people just don't understand how we got that. They fail massively to appreciate that. The people who started this country, 250 years ago, most of them escaped tyranny in foreign countries. Either themselves, their parents, or their grandparents did. And they came to this country to avoid that. And when they fought the Revolutionary War, the leaders who signed up for this thing and signed that Declaration of Independence, almost every one of them would have been executed for treason if they lost. I mean, they put their lives on the line for this so that we can enjoy this today. And, we just don't get it. And they're gradually taking more and more of our freedom away. And when they take too much, there's not much you can do. So you got to wake up, because this is a real threat to your personal freedom and liberty.
Yeah. Well, we thank you truly for paving the way. I know that many people consider you a major pioneer and a major influence, and just created the opportunity for us to even have these conversations.
Yeah.
So I appreciate it so much, and we're definitely going to take on your mission as well and contribute.
That's the only way it works.
Yeah.
We can stand together as a community and spread the truth, because truth will come to the surface, just like it is with the gain of function research. I was banned from Twitter from it. I mean, you cannot put a link to my site, Mercola.com, on your Twitter account to my account. They said this is like spyware or something. I forget what the warning was, but we're one of the only sites in the whole Twitter universe that they do that to. And you know why they did it? Because we were talking about the gain of function research,
which comes out that it was
true.
True.
Yeah,
that's crazy. That's crazy.
We're just telling the truth.
They recently relaxed on the censorship that was being done on Facebook, for example, when people were talking about this lab leak theory. Now, it's just like, why was that even put in place in the first place? That's so inappropriate to censor conversation, to censor science.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. But
again, it makes sense when you know the bigger picture.
Right, yes.
It definitely makes sense. There's reasons for it. But just to empower yourself with freedom and knowledge and information, because it's out there. You just have to search, and then, form groups and support, because, we don't want to continue to get away with this.
Well, I'm glad that you're here on the planet with us right now, and I just appreciate you. And I want to make sure that everybody picks up a copy of The Truth About COVID-19. You can pick this up I was surprised it was at the bookstore, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I
Barnes and
think,
Noble.
Amazon, they've
Yeah.
been out of stock for a while. They claimed that some books got damaged or destroyed or burned or something. I don't
Yeah, that's
know,
what I'm
but-
saying. I was surprised it was at the bookstore because of the book burning. You
I mean,
know,
they bought
because of
100,000
the
copies,
Fahrenheit.
which is really unusual before the launch. So it was definitely a bestseller.
Yeah,
But
well,
even despite all the suppression.
yeah, Dr. Mercola, you're a legend. I appreciate you so much. Thanks for stopping by.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
Bacteria and viruses were talking to our mitochondria, talking to our brain, talking to our heart, but we didn't know the language. And thanks to some Nobel Prize winning work, that language was discovered.